A soft knock on William's door woke him. Not the loud, insistent kind of knock that signals chaos. The kind of knock that tells you someone doesn't want to wake the children. The kind of knock that means, we need you. Now, quietly. When William opened the door, his private secretary was standing there, face pale, expression tight. The doctors are here. Those 4 words would lead William into one of the longest days of his life. Because the marker the doctor mentioned the previous night, the irregularity that didn't match earlier tests, had set off alarms within the Royal Medical Network. They needed clarity. They needed imaging. They needed data that could reveal what was happening inside William's body before the symptoms got worse. And they couldn't wait. William dressed quietly, deliberately, trying not to wake Kate or the children. But Kate was already awake. She didn't sleep much after the doctor's report. She sat up in bed, watching her husband pull on a sweater, her eyes heavy with fear she didn't want to show him. "Do you want me to come?" She asked the question gently, knowing that part of his instinct was to protect her, to shield her from the worst. But William shook his head softly. "Stay with the children. I'll be back soon." They both knew soon was a lie. Kate rose from the bed anyway. She walked to him, placed her hands on his chest, and whispered something only a spouse can say in moments like that. Words of comfort, words of grounding, words of love. William pressed his forehead against hers for a brief second. Then he left, closing the door quietly behind him. Downstairs, 2 doctors waited with equipment cases. They greeted him with solemn nods. No small talk, no royal pleasantries. Just business, serious, urgent business. They escorted him to a private medical room deep inside the palace, far from windows, far from curious eyes, far from any staff who might overhear. The air was cold, the room was dim, and the test awaiting him would reveal far more than anyone expected. The lead physician explained the plan. They needed full neurological imaging right away. Portable MRI technology had already been brought in. They would conduct brain scans, nerve conduction tests, and a series of evaluations designed to pinpoint exactly what the progressed symptoms meant. William listened carefully, nodding, his jaw tight. He asked one question before they began. "Will this answer what we need to know?" The doctor hesitated, not what you want to see before undergoing life-altering tests, and said, "It will give us a direction." Direction, not clarity, not confirmation. Direction, but it had to be done. They began with balance and coordination tests. William stood on one leg, closed his eyes, extended his arms, followed the doctor's finger with his gaze. Some motions were smooth. Others, not so much. One test required him to walk heel-to-toe across a line. He stumbled, not severely, but enough for the doctor to write something down without lifting his gaze. Then came reflex tests, grip strength tests, cognitive recall, short-term memory checks, reaction time assessments. These took nearly an hour, but nothing compared to what came next. The MRI. It's not like the typical hospital setup. Royals have access to advanced portable scanners meant for field hospitals and emergencies. But even then, the machine filled the room with a low, humming vibration that made the air feel dense. William lay down on the padded surface. It felt cold. Too cold. Aides adjusted a blanket over his legs, but the chill wasn't from the room. It was from the fear sitting inside him. Fear he refused to show. As the machine began to whir, the doctor gave him headphones. Not for comfort, but to drown out the grinding sound of the imaging coils. But the sound wasn't the problem. The problem was the thoughts. What if the test confirmed the doctor's worst suspicion? What if the progression was faster than expected? What if this wasn't temporary? What if this meant stepping back? What if the condition affected him at coronation? What if the children found out? What if this affected his ability to be king? What if? The scan lasted 40 minutes. 40 minutes of lying still. 40 minutes of internal spiraling. 40 minutes of imagining every possible outcome. 40 minutes of praying the results wouldn't take his future from him. When the machine finally powered down, William sat up slowly, as though standing too fast might reveal something terrifying. The doctor told him to wait as the data processed. 10 minutes. 20 minutes. 30 minutes. William sat alone for much of it, hands clasped, elbows on his knees, head down. A man who has carried the weight of duty his whole life, now sitting under the crushing weight of uncertainty. When the doctors returned, The silence spoke louder than their footsteps. They didn't exchange hopeful looks. They didn't carry themselves with optimism. They didn't offer reassuring gestures. They looked tense. The lead physician sat across from William and opened the scan images on a portable monitor. And that was the moment everything changed. The doctor pointed to one area of the scan, a small region, barely noticeable to an untrained eye, but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. That area concerns us, the doctor said quietly. William leaned forward, his breath catching. What does it mean? We won't know definitively until genetic sequencing and further imaging, but the pattern suggests possible involvement of neurological pathways we previously believed were unaffected. Previously, meaning the condition had spread. Kate entered the room then, having been summoned the moment the doctor saw the first concerning marker. She rushed to William's side, her eyes locked on the screen. What does that mean? She asked softly, her voice shaking. The doctor swallowed, choosing his words carefully. It means the condition may be progressing more rapidly than anticipated. Kate's hand flew to her mouth. William closed his eyes again. The doctor continued, explaining that while nothing was confirmed yet, the progression suggested the condition might affect balance, cognitive endurance, and stress response more intensely in the future. For a private citizen, that would be overwhelming. For a future king, potentially devastating. He explained that they needed to conduct a specialized test that combined imaging with neuroelectrical mapping. A test so rare it required flying in an expert from Switzerland, someone who had worked with neurological cases in high-pressure professions like pilots, military executives, and world leaders. Arrangements were already underway. As William listened to every detail, one thought kept echoing through his mind. This is real. This is happening. This is my life now. But the doctor wasn't finished. He showed additional images, subtle areas of inflammation that indicated the body was fighting something chronic, something systemic, something that could not be ignored. Kate grasped William's arm tightly. Is this life-threatening? The doctor responded with silence before answering. We don't believe so right now, but the progression is concerning. And without intervention, symptoms may worsen significantly. Worsen, not stabilize, not plateau. Worsen. William stood slowly, pacing the room, running his hands through his hair as he tried to process everything. He wanted clarity, answers, certainty. But the one thing the tests provided that morning was the one thing he least wanted. Possibility. Possibility of decline. Possibility of future complications. Possibility of permanent changes. Possibility of needing long-term medical management. And, though no one said it aloud, possibility of being unable to fulfill the duties expected of a king. That thought nearly broke him. He turned to the doctor, his expression suddenly sharper, more determined. What do I need to do next? The doctor outlined immediate steps. More tests, genetic mapping, neurological consultations, lifestyle adjustments, reduced schedule, stress management, monitoring, treatment trials. William listened but didn't respond. Kate squeezed his hand again, hoping to anchor him. But nothing could anchor what was coming next. Because just as the doctor moved to close the folder, he paused. There's one more thing, he said. William looked up. That's when the doctor explained the most unsettling part of the morning's results. The irregular marker they'd found, the one that triggered the emergency imaging, it didn't match William's previous medical profile. It didn't match the initial diagnosis. It didn't match known patterns of the condition they were monitoring. It was something new, something unfamiliar. Something that made the doctor exchange a worried glance with the neurologist beside him. We need to determine what this means, the doctor said, his voice low. And we need to do it quickly. William felt the blood drain from his face. Kate froze. What are you saying? She whispered. The doctor inhaled deeply. It may indicate that this is not just progression of the original condition, but possibly the emergence of something additional. Additional? Another condition? A complication? A second diagnosis? The doctor didn't say the word aloud, but William heard it. Kate heard it. Everyone in that room heard it. And that word was compounded. A compounded condition. A compounded diagnosis. A compounded threat. The test that was supposed to answer questions had created more, far more, than anyone expected. And the only way to know the truth was to conduct the next round of diagnostics. Urgent diagnostics. High-level consultations. Specialists from multiple countries. This wasn't a private health concern anymore. This was a royal emergency. And the next test, scheduled within hours, would reveal whether William's future looked challenging or catastrophic. Because the test that changed his future wasn't the MRI. It was the one that came next. The one that would expose the truth behind the mysterious new marker. A truth that no one, not William, not Kate, not the palace, was prepared to face. And what that test revealed about the Prince of Wales would shake the monarchy to its foundations. It was the sentence no one in that room wanted to hear, yet everyone knew was coming. A sentence so heavy, so defining, so irreversible that it seemed to echo through the walls of Kensington Palace long after the doctor stopped speaking. We have confirmation. Two words that hit with the force of a hammer. Confirmation of what? Confirmation of fear. Confirmation of progression. Confirmation that the whispers in the corridors were not exaggerations, but understatements. But here's the truth. Confirmation isn't clarity. It's the doorway to it. And what stood on the other side of that doorway would alter William's future in ways he hadn't been ready to confront. Let's step back into that room. The air thick, the lighting harsh, the silence unbearable. The neurologist sat across from William with the results they'd obtained after hours of advanced testing. Kate stood behind him, hand resting on his shoulder, her eyes red from silent crying. Another doctor stood near the window, avoiding eye contact as though the truth on those pages might spill from his lips if he looked at them too long. The future King of England braced himself, and the doctor began. He didn't jump straight to the point. Medical professionals rarely do in moments like this. Instead, he started with what they ruled out, because that's how you soften the blow. It isn't a tumor. It isn't a mass. It isn't vascular. It isn't an infection. Each eliminated possibility was a fleeting moment of relief, followed by dread. Because if it wasn't those things, then what remained? Then the neurologist took a long breath and said the words that pulled every bit of warmth from the room. What you're experiencing is consistent with a progressive neurological condition. That word again. Progressive. A word that suggests motion, but not the kind anyone wants. Motion toward more symptoms, more complications, more limitations. A condition with no switch to flip off, no timer to stop, no simple cure. Kate's breath caught. William stared straight ahead. The doctor kept speaking, explaining that the imaging results showed subtle but undeniable changes in certain pathways. Pathways responsible for balance, fine motor control, and cognitive endurance. Not intelligence. William was as sharp as ever. Not memory. At least not yet. But endurance. The ability to sustain long periods of concentration. The ability to stand for extended engagements. The ability to regulate physical stress during long workdays. A future king's life revolves around endurance. State banquets, meetings, diplomatic visits, hours of briefings, public appearances, ceremonies, constitutional duties. Without endurance, the monarchy doesn't function. The doctor explained that the test results aligned with a neurological disorder that can remain subtle for years before its symptoms fully emerge. And in many cases, the condition is manageable, but only with treatment, rest, and strict monitoring. Royal life offers none of those luxuries. But the worst part, the part that struck the deepest, wasn't what the condition already was. It was what it could become if ignored. The doctor pulled out a chart. He pointed to a timeline. He outlined potential scenarios. In one scenario, the condition stabilizes with treatment. In another, it worsens slowly. In the third, symptoms accelerate under prolonged stress. Guess which lifestyle category a working royal falls into? The doctor said it gently, but the implication was brutal. Your current workload is not compatible with the treatment we recommend. Not compatible. Not sustainable. Not safe. For the first time, William turned to face Kate fully, and the look in her eyes nearly broke him. She had been strong through all the previous tests, but the mention of long-term implications, of potentially stepping back, hit her straight in the heart. Because this wasn't just about a title, or a crown, or a monarchy. This was about the man she loved. So William asked the question that every royal, every leader, every person facing a life-altering diagnosis asks. What does this mean for my future? The doctor didn't look at the chart. He didn't review the folder. He looked at William with quiet honesty. It means adjustments. Significant adjustments. William leaned forward. What kind of adjustments? The doctor didn't flinch. Reduced stress, limited physical strain, shorter workdays, more rest, more recovery, and depending on how treatment progresses, a restriction on certain high-pressure duties. The room went still. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a necessity. A future king, restricted. Kate's hand tightened on his shoulder. William closed his eyes, breathing deeply, trying to imagine a version of his life where he wasn't the first to arrive and the last to leave. A version where duty wasn't the driving force behind every breath he took. A version where rest, something he never prioritized, became mandatory. But it wasn't just about him. So he asked the second question, the one that weighed even heavier. How will this affect my ability to become king? The doctor sighed softly, the weight of the answer pressing into his shoulders. Right now, you can continue working. But without treatment and lifestyle adjustments, your long-term capacity may be affected. May be affected. Not will be. Not won't be. May be. But that may carried the kind of uncertainty that keeps people awake at night. Then came the part William dreaded, the part that had haunted him since the doctor first mentioned progression. Kate whispered at first, unable to silence the fear tightening her throat. Is this hereditary? The doctor paused, a pause that stretched seconds into eternity. We need additional testing to know for certain. Hereditary. The word struck like lightning. William thought of George, of Charlotte, of Louis. Their laughter, their futures, their responsibilities. Could he have passed this on? Even the possibility twisted him inside. Kate turned away, pressing her hand to her forehead, tears spilling before she could stop them. Not loud tears. Quiet ones. The kind you let slip only because you're too consumed by fear to fight them. William stood and walked to the window, staring out at the gardens beyond the palace walls. The world outside looked normal, peaceful, still, completely unaware that inside this grand building, the future of the monarchy was hanging in the balance. The doctor gave him a moment, a long one. He needed it. When William finally turned back, his voice was low but steady. What do we do next? The doctor opened the folder again, flipping to the treatment plan. We begin therapy immediately. We arrange consultations with specialists. We adjust your schedule. We monitor your symptoms daily. And we prepare for the possibility that this condition may require a long-term strategy. A long-term strategy for a chronic condition. A prince does not receive that kind of recommendation unless the situation is serious, far more serious than the palace would ever admit publicly. Then came the final blow. The doctor explained that the irregular marker they discovered, the one that puzzled the medical team, had potential implications beyond the initial diagnosis. It might indicate a secondary process occurring simultaneously, something inflammatory, something systemic, something that could complicate the primary condition. William's jaw clenched. What does that mean? The doctor exhaled slowly. It means we may be dealing with more than one issue. More than one issue. A compounded diagnosis. A layered medical situation. A reality no one wanted, but one they could no longer deny. Kate covered her mouth again, tears streaming anew. William reached for her hand, grounding her even as his own world tilted beneath him. The doctor outlined next steps. Blood work, advanced neurological mapping, genetic testing, consultations with international experts. But William barely heard the details. All he heard was this. Your diagnosis is real. Your condition is progressive. Your life is changing. Your future is uncertain. Your responsibilities may need to shift. Your family could be affected. And the worst part wasn't the diagnosis. It was what the diagnosis meant. Because this was no longer about William feeling tired or occasionally losing balance. It was about the possibility of the monarchy preparing for a future no one was ready to face. The doctor gathered his papers, preparing to leave, when William asked one final question, one he had been holding back since the moment the word progressive first appeared. Is there any chance this could get worse quickly? The doctor hesitated. And in that hesitation, the truth arrived. There is a possibility. Kate gasped. William closed his eyes. Possibility. Not probability, but possibility. And possibility is enough to change everything. The doctor left, softly closing the door behind him. William stood frozen. Kate reached for him. He didn't move, because now he understood. The diagnosis wasn't just an answer. It was a warning that the path forward would not be easy, a warning that the monarchy might need to adapt. A warning that the future King of England was confronting a battle he couldn't hide much longer. And then came the message that shattered whatever hope they had left of keeping this quiet. A discreet knock. A nervous aid. A whispered sentence. "Sir, the press has the story. The night Princess Diana died has been dissected so many times that it almost feels like the world has memorized every frame of it. The speeding car, the Paris tunnel, the flashing cameras, the chaos, the unanswered questions. But what if all of that, the story we've repeated for decades, was only the surface? What if the real story, the one buried behind palace gates and locked filing rooms, began long before the crash and continued long after the world believed it had ended?" Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. And what if the person now pulling back the curtain is not a journalist, not a whistleblower, not a royal staffer, but one of Diana's own sons? Ask yourself this. Why would a full-grown man, raised within palace walls and trained never to break the institution's silence, suddenly feel compelled to speak now? Why now, of all moments? Would he reveal what he was told to forget, what he was pressured to bury, what he spent years trying to outrun? What changed? Because according to him, his mother's final night wasn't just a tragic accident. It was a night thick with fear, contradictions, missing voices, and a level of control that no one outside the palace was ever meant to see. And the center of that silence, the person who allegedly ensured that silence, was King Charles. For years, whispers floated around. Rumors, staff resignations, sudden payoffs, locked storage rooms, lost reports. But now we have something different. Now we have a son speaking, not as a prince, but as a man who lost his mother in the most public yet suspicious way imaginable. A man who has finally decided to reveal what he was told as a terrified young boy, what he pieced together as he grew older, and what he uncovered in private investigations that he never intended to share until now. Let me ask you another question. If nothing was wrong with Diana's final night, why were staff members allegedly paid to stay silent? Why did key witnesses vanish from royal employment lists weeks afterward? Why did palace aides burn documents in the middle of the night? Why were early statements edited, polished, corrected multiple times before being handed to the world? These are not theories. These are documented patterns, and Diana's son knows them. But here's the part that should make your heart stop. The version of events he learned inside the palace didn't match what the world was told. Not even close. He learned details that would make even the most loyal royal watchers question everything. He learned about the missing CCTV footage, about the staffer who warned Diana hours before her death and then vanished, about the frantic, panicked emergency meeting held inside the palace just hours after the crash, about money, yes, money, quietly distributed to royal employees who suddenly became very, very quiet. And the more he uncovered, the more a chilling picture formed, one that pointed directly toward the man who would later become King Charles. But before he could process any of this, before he could ask questions, challenge adults, or seek the truth, he was silenced. Not explicitly, not with threats or harsh words, but with the same suffocating royal technique perfected over generations. Control the atmosphere, control the narrative, control the emotions. You don't ask questions. You don't seek answers. You don't dig. You accept. But grief has a way of keeping old wounds open. And for Diana's son, that wound was never allowed to heal. Imagine being a child and hearing whispers that your mother was afraid in the days leading up to her death, that she believed she was being followed, that she told friends she felt something terrible was coming. Then imagine growing up and realizing the palace never mentioned any of this. Not to you, not to your brother, not to the public. Why? Why ignore a woman's voice when she predicted her own death? Why erase staff testimonies? Why hide letters? Why pay people to keep quiet? Why burn papers? Why deny every anomaly, every inconsistency, every warning sign? Why rush to control the narrative hours after her death instead of allowing investigators to lead? Why did it take decades for one of her sons, one of the only people she trusted completely, to finally speak up? The answer Diana's son gives is devastatingly simple, because the truth threatened the monarchy. He says the institution knew the truth could destroy everything. It wasn't merely scandal, it was destabilization. It was the kind of revelation that could ruin a king, shatter public trust, and rewrite royal history. But there was one thing Charles didn't anticipate: that a son's love for his mother would one day outweigh his fear of the crown. This son, who grew up being told the official version of events didn't need to be questioned, eventually walked the same halls where staff once stood. He saw faces missing that should have still been there. He found records edited, employment histories shortened, retirement packages processed at strange moments, conversations abruptly ending when he walked into a room, staff avoiding speaking about his mother entirely, as if mentioning her name was crossing some invisible line. And the silence was too consistent to be accidental. That's what haunted him. That's what pushed him to dig. And the deeper he dug, the more he realized the silence wasn't protection. It was suppression. One staff member allegedly confessed privately, years after retiring, that they had been paid a sum far larger than expected. When asked why they received it, their answer was cryptic: for keeping the peace. Another staffer supposedly said they were instructed never to mention the final night in front of the boys. And then there was the one employee who tried to speak out and was gone the next day. Not fired, not dismissed, just gone from records, as if they'd never existed at all. Diana's son says he was too young to understand it then. But as an adult, those gaps in memory, those missing pages, those unanswered questions, they all came back with force. Have you ever had a moment where something suddenly made sense after years of confusion? A puzzle piece that clicks into place and changes the entire picture? That was his experience. And once he saw the full picture, he could never unsee it. That is why he's talking now. Because silence protects the powerful, not the innocent. And he will not let silence define his mother's story. But before he tells the world the truth as he sees it, before he explains what really happened, why Charles allegedly paid off staff, and what Diana told him and his brother in her final days, he wants to begin with something everyone thinks they already know. The final night. The night that changed everything. The night the world lost Diana and two boys lost their mother. But this time, you're going to hear it not from official statements, not from royal spokespeople, not from carefully curated documentaries. You're going to hear it from him. From the only person who can reveal what a mother whispered, what a palace hid, and what a king allegedly paid dearly to keep buried. And what he reveals will force you to question everything. Because as you're about to learn, the truth isn't just different from the official story. It's far, far darker. And we begin with the moment Diana realized she wasn't safe. The moment she made a call that someone didn't want the world to hear. The moment her son now says was the first sign that the final night was no accident at all. And once you hear what she said, you'll understand why Charles allegedly moved so quickly to cover everything that came next. She was in Paris, but her mind wasn't in Paris. That's the part most people forget. Diana wasn't relaxed. She wasn't carefree. She wasn't swept up in a glamorous evening. She was unsettled, distracted, watching shadows instead of scenery, checking her surroundings, noticing things that didn't feel right. And when she called someone she trusted that night, hours before the crash, she said something that still sends chills down the spine of her son today. They're watching me again. Not the paparazzi. Not the fans. Not the press. She meant something else. Someone else. And this wasn't paranoia. This wasn't fear exaggerated by stress. Diana had been dealing with strange incidents for months. Misplaced letters. Cars following her. Phones clicking at odd times. Staff members she trusted suddenly transferred without explanation. Doors she knew she locked found open. She told people about these things. She wrote them down. She warned friends. She even hinted about it in interviews. So when she made that phone call in Paris, it wasn't random fear. It was confirmation. And this, the moment Diana felt the walls closing in, is where her son begins his version of events. Because he says this phone call was one of the details Charles never wanted mentioned. A detail that didn't fit the tragic accident narrative. A detail that made everything too complicated, too suspicious, too dangerous. Because if Diana sensed danger before the crash, then the crash wasn't just a coincidence. Her son remembers where he was when he was told about her death. He remembers the coldness, the stillness, the confusion, the adults whispering in the next room. The way conversations stopped when he walked past. The way nobody explained anything, even when he begged them to. And here's what truly haunts him. He wasn't even told the full truth of where, how, or why it happened until he was old enough to look up articles for himself. Think about that. A global tragedy. His own mother. And he had to piece together the story on his own. Because the palace wasn't going to tell him. Why? Why hide details from a grieving child? Why protect the narrative more than the boy? That's what made him question everything as he got older. That's what made him wonder what else was being kept from him. That's what led him to revisit the places where staff members once stood, only to find them replaced, relocated, or removed entirely. And the more he asked, the less the palace seemed willing to say. He remembers approaching someone who had worked close to Diana, someone who had comforted her through difficult days, someone he expected would welcome the chance to talk about his mother. Instead, the person froze. Their face changed. Their eyes widened, just slightly, but enough for him to notice. "I can't," they whispered, and they walked away. He didn't understand it then, but years later, he would. He would realize that some palace workers weren't silent because of loyalty. They were silent because they had been paid to be. Paid generously. Paid suddenly. Paid oddly close to the timeline of Diana's death. And when he eventually saw the financial patterns, quiet bonuses, early pensions, abrupt severance packages, everything began to look less like coincidence and more like choreography. He once confronted an aide who had been in the palace the night the news broke. The aide avoided eye contact, wiped their palms nervously, and said something that disturbed him deeply. "Your mother knew things she wasn't supposed to know." "What things? Which secrets? Whose secrets?" The aide never clarified. They wouldn't. They simply ended the conversation there and made it clear they didn't want to be involved. And the son was left with more questions than answers. But here's the part that changed everything for him. As an adult, he gained access to records, reports, and private notes that were not available to him as a child. Some were incomplete, some heavily edited, some partially destroyed, some confused him. But there were pieces, small but crucial, that didn't match the official story at all. Like the fact that one of Diana's closest staff members had attempted to record a statement about her final days, only for that statement to disappear. Like the fact that Diana's personal letters referencing her fears were categorized as sensitive internal communications and stored in a restricted access vault. Like the fact that certain discussions within the palace about the aftermath of her death were classified and sealed, some for decades. Why seal anything? Why limit access? Why hide parts of a story that was supposedly straightforward? Unless it wasn't straightforward. Unless someone needed it to appear straightforward. And that someone, according to Diana's son, was Charles. Not the grieving ex-husband shown trembling in public. Not the devastated royal father walking behind her coffin. But the man behind closed doors. The man terrified of what Diana had been planning. The man who allegedly knew her voice could topple everything. The son describes a palace culture where silence wasn't a suggestion, it was a requirement. Where speaking out wasn't discouraged, it was forbidden. Where loyalty wasn't earned, it was purchased. And with that purchase came fear. Fear of losing one's home. Fear of losing one's pension. Fear of losing one's position. Fear of losing access to power. Because make no mistake, the monarchy has never been gentle with those who refuse to fall in line. So when whispers emerged from inside the palace that Charles had taken care of things, no one questioned it. No one dared. Taking care of things could mean a dozen different actions, but the effect was always the same. Silence. And yet, Diana had always warned her sons to trust their instincts, to never ignore the feeling that something wasn't right. She told them that truth has a way of resurfacing, even if buried deep. She told them that courage is choosing to speak when silence is easier. And those words dug themselves into her son's memory. So when he began piecing together the anomalies, the missing footage, the erased staff records, the sudden retirements, the altered reports, he didn't stop. He couldn't, because every missing piece of information felt like a reminder of his mother's fear. Every unanswered question felt like a whisper from her. He remembers the moment he realized the official story was impossible. It wasn't one big revelation. It wasn't one shocking document. It wasn't one confession. It was a pattern of quiet cover-ups, a pattern of disappearing staff, a pattern of controlled narratives, a pattern of contradictions, and every pattern pointed in the same direction. He says Charles knew more than he admitted. He says Charles wanted the world to remember the public Diana, but forget the vulnerable Diana, the suspicious Diana, the Diana who believed she was being watched. He says Charles feared what would come out if people spoke freely. He says the quiet payouts weren't coincidences, they were strategic. And he says the truth of Diana's final night is far from what the world was told. The official timeline. The Sun says it hides more than it reveals. The official conclusions? He says they ignore evidence that was intentionally buried. The official narrative? He says it was polished, scrubbed, edited, and approved by the one person who needed it to remain intact. King Charles. But this story isn't just about money or silence or power. It's about a mother trying to protect her sons, right until the last day of her life. It's about a woman who sensed danger closing in. It's about the message she tried to send before her voice was lost forever. It's about the truth her son refuses to bury any longer. And now, he wants to start from the beginning. Not the beginning the palace gave you. The real beginning. The moment Diana picked up the phone in Paris and said the words that would come to define everything that followed. They're watching me again. Because whoever was watching her that night was the reason Charles allegedly scrambled palace staff, opened private funds, and bought more silence than the public ever realized. And the first person who sensed the truth was Diana herself. What she said in that phone call is the key to everything. But to understand its full weight, you must understand who heard it, and why that person disappeared shortly afterward. The last phone call Diana made is the part of the story the palace hoped people would forget. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't staged. There were no cameras, no lights, no reporters. Just a quiet voice, speaking through a moment of fear, confessing something she had sensed long before the crash. And when Diana's son finally learned the truth about that call, who she spoke to, what she said, and why that person disappeared, it shook him more than anything else he uncovered. Because it proved one thing. Diana didn't enter that Paris tunnel blindly. She entered it afraid. You can imagine the room where she made the call. Not the glamorous hotel suite people picture when they think of Diana's final night. No, she wasn't resting. She wasn't luxuriating. She wasn't preparing for a carefree evening. She was pacing, checking the window, checking the hallway, checking shadows. She told someone earlier that day that she didn't feel alone, that she felt observed. She didn't explain it further, but she didn't need to. She had said the same thing weeks before, and months before, and earlier that year. Always the same warning. Someone is watching me. The palace dismissed it as nerves. The public dismissed it as stress. The press dismissed it as imagination. But the person she called that night didn't dismiss it. This person, let's call him the listener, wasn't a royal insider, not fully. He wasn't a journalist. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a lover or secret partner. He was something far more dangerous to the institution. Someone who knew Diana intimately, but had nothing to lose by being honest with her. He worked closely enough with her schedule to know when things changed suddenly. He knew her moods, her signals, her coded language. He wasn't royalty, but he understood royalty better than most. And on the phone that night, Diana's voice wasn't panicked. It was resigned. She said, "It's happening again." Imagine hearing that from someone who had already predicted disaster once before. Imagine hearing it from someone who said she feared for her life. The listener asked what she meant, and Diana hesitated, just long enough for him to understand she didn't want to say it out loud. Not on the phone. Not when she already suspected her calls were tapped. So she said something vague but unmistakable. People are moving differently tonight. People. Not press. Not paparazzi. People. Diana had always distinguished the two. The paparazzi she could recognize instantly. But the other people, the ones who watch without being obvious, those were the ones she feared most. She told the listener that decisions were being made around her, not with her. That the car change had been sudden. That she didn't trust certain individuals that night. She didn't specify who. She didn't specify why. She only said she felt the energy shift. And the listener believed her. He later told someone, one of the few who ever heard this story, that Diana didn't sound emotional. She sounded certain. Certain in a way that made him uneasy. But here is where it becomes chilling. According to Diana's son, the palace never mentioned this call. Not to him. Not to his brother. Not to the public. Not even to investigators unless forced. And the reason is simple. This call suggested premeditation. This call suggested she sensed danger. This call shattered the narrative of a carefree evening turned tragic. Diana's son later learned that the palace labeled this call irrelevant to the timeline. Irrelevant? A phone call in which Diana expressed fear? hours before her death? How could that be irrelevant? Unless acknowledging it raised too many questions. Questions that pointed towards several people the palace didn't want scrutinized. Questions like, why did Diana feel she was being watched? Who was watching her? Why did she feel unsafe that night specifically? Who changed the driver? Who altered the security plan? Who decided she should travel in a different car? Why was she not given her usual protection? And why did she fear the people around her more than the paparazzi chasing her? These are the questions Diana's son grew up with. Questions he was never given answers to. But he found something else, something worse. The listener disappeared after that night. Not physically, not dramatically, administratively. His name faded from palace employment lists. His access pass was deactivated. His previous travel records vanished. He didn't get a retirement ceremony, a farewell letter, or a mention in staff newsletters. He simply ceased to exist on paper. And if you know anything about royal protocol, you know that doesn't happen by accident. People don't vanish from royal documentation. They only vanish when someone wants them gone. So Diana's son asked about him. He was older then, old enough to start pressing for answers. He asked seasoned staff, newer staff, friends, former aides. Every time, he got the same response. A long pause. A blank stare. A shift in tone. A quiet, nervous, I don't remember him. But here's the contradiction. The listener wasn't forgettable. He had been around for years. He was present in photos that were later cropped. He was mentioned casually in Diana's older letters. He appeared in visitor logs, until those logs were updated. He had personal connections to multiple staff members, connections they no longer acknowledged. So how does an entire human being simply slip everyone's mind after the death of the most beloved woman in the world? Diana's son found that impossible to believe. And honestly, don't you? He kept digging, looking through old boxes, unpacking sealed trunks, tracking down former staff who had moved abroad, collecting fragments of information, piecing together a life that had been erased piece by piece. One woman, now retired, finally cracked. She told him the listener didn't disappear. He was removed. Deliberately, quietly, efficiently. She said something else too, something he never forgot. He knew too much. That's why they paid him. Paid him. That was the word that stuck with Diana's son, because he had heard that word before. He had heard whispers of people being taken care of after the crash. He had seen financial records showing unusual payouts. He had heard rumors of bonuses that didn't match any job description. But hearing that someone close to his mother, a confidant she trusted enough to call on her final night, had been paid off, that changed everything. He asked the woman what the listener knew. She hesitated, looked around, even though they were alone, lowered her voice to a whisper. He knew about the other calls. Other calls? Plural? Diana's son had never heard of other calls. He didn't even know who she meant. Were these calls made by Diana? Were they made to her? Were they intercepted? Logged? Deleted? But before he could ask more, the woman shut down. She regretted saying those few words. Her eyes filled with fear. The same fear he had seen in others who worked for the palace during that era. He tried so many times later to contact her, to ask follow-up questions, to dig deeper. She never spoke to him again. And the listener? Still missing. Still erased. Still forgotten. But not by Diana. And not by her son. Because the last thing Diana said during that phone call, the sentence the listener repeated to a friend before he vanished, was the detail that made everything crumble. She said, "They want me quiet." Imagine hearing that the night before she died. Imagine knowing she said that. And imagine learning that the man who heard those words was erased from royal life completely. Diana's son says this is the moment he knew the official story wasn't enough. This was the moment the puzzle pieces stopped fitting. This was the moment he understood. His mother didn't fear the world. She feared something closer. Something, or someone, within reach. And the only person with the authority, influence, and motive to erase the listener was Charles. But the call wasn't the only clue. It wasn't even the most damning one. Because Diana didn't just call someone that night. She told someone else, someone inside the palace, what she saw on the streets of Paris. And that person was the next to disappear. Diana wasn't a woman who panicked easily. She'd lived through palace wars, media storms, betrayal, humiliation, heartbreak, global scrutiny. She had faced down some of the most ruthless forces imaginable: political, royal, tabloid, institutional. Fear wasn't new to her. But the fear she felt in Paris was different. It was targeted, specific, focused. She wasn't afraid of crowds, cameras, or chaos. She was afraid of individuals. And that distinction matters more than anyone realized. Because right after she hung up with the listener, Diana approached someone else. Someone closer. Someone who had been part of the royal machinery long enough to know when the gears were turning in a different direction. Let's call this second person the observer. The observer worked inside the palace. He wasn't glamorous. He wasn't a high-ranking official. He wasn't the kind of figure who gets biographers or documentaries or tribute letters. He was quiet, invisible, a behind-the-scenes presence. The kind of staffer who knows the inner workings because he sees everything while being seen by no one. Diana trusted him, not with her heart, not with her secrets, but with her instincts. Because he had one quality most people in the royal world don't. He noticed things. He noticed when staff rotations suddenly changed without explanation. He noticed when schedules were rewritten, but the official calendar didn't reflect it. He noticed when meetings were held late at night that didn't appear on any agenda. He noticed when Charles's private secretary made calls outside normal communication protocols. He noticed the things the palace didn't want noticed. And on that final night, Diana reached out to him too. She didn't have a long conversation with him. There wasn't time. But what she told him was short, sharp, and deeply alarming. She said, "Someone switched the drivers." He didn't understand what she meant at first. Drivers are switched all the time. Schedules change. Assignments rotate. Nothing unusual. But Diana clarified. They didn't tell me. That was the red flag. When a principal's driver is changed, especially someone like Diana, protocol dictates she is informed. Not for courtesy, for safety. But this time, no explanation, no briefing, nothing. She told the observer she felt that the switch wasn't normal, that she sensed tension among the staff in Paris, that she spotted men outside the hotel who didn't look like paparazzi, men who weren't holding cameras, men who watched but didn't chase, men who blended in too well. The observer wanted details. Diana didn't give them. She didn't want to say too much, especially over a line she wasn't sure was secure. But she said something that unsettled him for years afterward. The driver doesn't know everything. Everything. What everything? What was he supposed to know? The observer later tried to contact Diana again. He couldn't reach her. Hours passed. Then the news broke. And his world, like everyone's, shattered. But his involvement didn't end there. He showed up at the palace after hearing of her death. He expected chaos. Instead, he found something stranger: calm organization. Not grief-stricken chaos. Not confusion. Not despair. Control. Quiet control. Doors locked that were usually open. Archives accessed in the middle of the night. Senior staff whispering urgently. Security escorting people away from sensitive areas. And at the center of the storm, Charles's most trusted advisors. What the observer witnessed next is what sealed his fate. He saw one advisor, someone who had worked closely with Charles for years, carrying a stack of documents out of Diana's private file room. Documents that later could not be located. Documents containing handwritten notes Diana made about her fears. According to Diana's son, the observer didn't just see it, he reported it. And that report was never filed, never logged, never acknowledged. Instead, 2 weeks later, he was offered a retirement package. A generous one, more generous than anything he'd seen in his career. He refused it, politely at first, then firmly. 3 days later, he was dismissed for structural reorganization. But the dismissal didn't bother him as much as something else. His entire personnel file was rewritten. Years of service gone. Commendations missing. Transfers unrecorded. Notes erased. He went from a long-serving palace worker to a footnote, someone who appeared to have barely been employed at all. Why? Because he had seen too much. And Diana's son would later confirm this after discovering irregularities in the observer's employment history. Irregularities that matched one pattern. The pattern of staff removed after Diana's death. The observer tried to live quietly. He moved out of London. Found a modest home. Tried to disappear. But the guilt ate at him. The silence crushed him. He had witnessed something he didn't fully understand, but he knew it was important. And he knew that if he spoke, he would lose everything. Years later, when Diana's son tracked him down, the observer was an old man. Fragile. Slower. But his memory? Sharp. Too sharp. The son sat with him. Asked gently. Asked respectfully. Asked like someone desperate for answers about the woman he lost. And at first, the observer refused. He said he had nothing helpful, nothing important, nothing official. But the son kept pressing, not aggressively, not forcefully, but with the sorrow only a child of Diana could understand. Finally, after a long silence, the old man whispered. She knew. The son asked. Knew what? The observer closed his eyes. That something had been planned. Those words changed everything. Because until then, Diana's son had theories, suspicions, contradictions, fragments. But this was a confirmation. Diana had sensed danger. She had recognized a pattern. She had seen familiar behaviors. She had connected dots no one wanted connected. And she voiced it to two people that night. The listener and the observer. The listener was erased. The observer was removed. But the son? The son was determined. He asked the old man what Diana meant by planned. What had she seen? What had she noticed? What made her say that? And the observer told him the one detail that tied everything together. He said, she saw someone in Paris who shouldn't have been there. Someone from the palace? Someone connected to Charles? Someone from the security services? Someone from the old guard? The observer didn't know, or wouldn't say. But he revealed one more detail. A detail that made the son feel physically ill. Diana described the man as someone Charles relied on. Charles relied on. That phrase echoed through the son's mind for years. Who would Charles rely on enough to send to Paris? Who would he trust to operate quietly? Who would he use to manage a situation he didn't want publicly linked to him? The observer died a short time later. His story died with him. But the son never forgot it. And everything he learned afterward, the financial cover-ups, the erased staff, the missing footage, fit the same chilling pattern Diana had hinted at. She wasn't running from paparazzi. She was running from something else. And the truth of that final night wasn't buried in Paris. It was buried in the palace. But if Diana saw someone she recognized, someone tied to Charles, someone not supposed to be in Paris, then who was he? And what was he doing there? What he was doing would only become clear when Diana's son discovered the note left behind by the driver. A note no one in the palace ever wanted him to see. He wasn't supposed to leave a note. Drivers don't do that. Not royal drivers. Not men trained in silence. Not men who know that every word they speak, every glance, every hesitation, can cost them their career, their livelihood, their home. And yet, he did. Diana's final driver, the man whose last moments have been analyzed, blamed, dissected, and rewritten more than any driver in modern history, left behind something that was never meant to exist. A warning, a written one. And the palace has spent years pretending it never happened. You've heard the official version, the one repeated endlessly. The driver drunk, the car speeding, the paparazzi chasing, the tragedy unavoidable. But that version collapses the moment you learn about the note. Because this driver, let's call him the guide, was not reckless. He was not unstable. He was not sloppy. He was cautious, experienced, detailed, professional, and he was worried. The guide served Diana more times than people realize. He wasn't new. He wasn't a replacement. He wasn't someone pulled from a random rotation. He had watched her change over the years, watched her mature, watched her break free from the constraints of palace life, watched her grow into her own voice. And he saw what the palace ignored. Diana was afraid of something she refused to speak openly about. He noticed her scanning crowds. He noticed her avoiding certain routes. He noticed her asking for last-minute plan changes. He noticed her distress when unfamiliar security personnel appeared. So when he was called to drive her in Paris, he wasn't surprised that the atmosphere felt wrong. He mentioned it to a friend. He mentioned it to a colleague. He almost mentioned it to the press years before, but fear and silence held him back. But the note? The note survived. The guide wrote it on a small piece of paper the night before the crash, after discussing with a colleague that he felt he was being set up for something. He didn't explain what. He didn't specify who. But he wrote 4 words that haunted Diana's son the first time he saw them. They want a distraction. A distraction. Not an accident. Not a collision. Not a tragedy. A distraction. The son stared at that sentence for hours. Because if the driver believed someone wanted a distraction, then what was the real target? Was it Diana herself? Was it someone else with her? Was it a message? Or was it something larger? A shift in royal narrative? A resetting of public perception? A convenient moment to redirect headlines? The guide was careful with his words. He never wrote names, never wrote specifics, but he hinted, repeatedly, that the people around Diana weren't acting normally. He wrote, "The team is different tonight. They changed the route. I wasn't briefed. This feels wrong." And Diana's son has confirmed that none of these warnings were given to his family. The palace never disclosed them. They weren't entered into any official record. They weren't mentioned during investigations unless pressure forced it. Why hide a warning if it meant nothing? Why bury testimony if it was irrelevant? Why silence a man if his words held no power? Because his words did hold power. The guide noticed a black vehicle following them earlier that day. Not paparazzi. Paparazzi are visible, loud, aggressive. This vehicle was something else. Smooth, controlled, strategic. The guide mentioned it to the hotel staff. They brushed it off. He mentioned it to the security team. They minimized it. He mentioned it in the note. They're not journalists. Not journalists. Not fans. Not the press. So who were they? Diana's son asked that same question when he found the surviving copy of the note, hidden among archived materials that were never meant for him to see. His access came years later, thanks to a sympathetic insider who believed he deserved the truth. He remembers the moment he held the note in his hands. He remembers feeling cold. He remembers feeling nauseous. He remembers seeing the handwriting, steady, controlled, deliberate. He remembers thinking, why didn't anyone tell me? The answer was simple. Because the palace didn't want the world to know that the driver was frightened, that he sensed something off, that he believed someone wanted a distraction. Because once you acknowledge fear, once you acknowledge warnings, once you acknowledge premeditation, the entire official story collapses. But the note wasn't the only red flag. The guide told someone else something even more chilling the evening before the crash. He said, "She's not supposed to be here tonight." Not supposed to be here? What did that mean? Was Diana expected somewhere else? Was her travel plan altered? Was someone hoping she'd stay in London? Was there pressure for her to avoid Paris? Or was she simply too unpredictable for the palace's liking? The Sun later discovered that Diana had been invited to a small event that night, one she declined. An event where Charles was expected to appear. An event where her presence would have complicated everything. Strange coincidence, isn't it? The one night Diana didn't follow her usual patterns, something went wrong. But coincidences are rare in palace politics. The guide also said something else. It's not just the cameras. This is the phrase that bothers investigators to this day. Because if it wasn't the cameras, what was it? Traffic patterns? Suspicious vehicles? Communication changes? Unusual staff behavior? Orders from unidentified individuals? This was the final piece that pushed Diana's son over the edge. Because when he paired the driver's warnings with his mother's fears and the disappearance of staff who knew too much, he realized these weren't scattered fragments. They were threads, and when woven together, they formed a picture too disturbing to ignore. But the guide never got to explain those warnings. He never got to testify. He never got to clarify the meaning of the note. Because by the time investigators arrived, palace representatives had already sorted through the hotel's communications, removed personal belongings, and taken possession of several key items, including the guide's recorded logs. Not the police, not the French authorities, the palace. Diana's son has said publicly that the palace refused to release certain materials, calling them classified or irretrievable. Privately, he said something far more damning. Those materials weren't lost. They were hidden. He learned that the guide's family received unexpected financial support after his death. Not a fortune, not millions, but enough to raise eyebrows. Enough to signal a pattern. The same pattern as the listener. The same pattern as the observer. The same pattern repeated through dozens of staff members who were suddenly silent after Diana's death. And that's when Diana's son realized the horrifying truth. The people closest to his mother on her final night weren't lost to time. They had been silenced. But there was one more thing the driver wrote. One more statement that ties everything together. One more line that changed the son's understanding of that night forever. He wrote, "I don't know who ordered this." He didn't know, but someone did. Someone with influence. Someone with connections. Someone inside the royal circle. Someone who had something to lose if Diana continued speaking, continued revealing, continued living freely. The son tried to find more documents, more notes, more logs. But nearly everything was gone. Erased, burned, archived, and sealed for decades.